what drew me to social psychology in the first place was, to me, it was always about the marriage of art and science. So like I said, when I was coming out of high school, I was, all into English literature. That's what I was going to major in. And I took my first psychology classes, but hearing the stories about these really clever experiments, which required, it was almost like creating a play,
Yeah.
You had to create a script, and you had to have direction, and you had to make it believable, have the audience suspend disbelief, but within the constraints of science. So it's got to be done in a precise way where there's not confounds and demand characteristics.
You just heard Steven Fein from Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Garth interviewed Steve for episode 208 of Psych Sessions, Conversations about Teaching and Stuff.
Sage Publishing is proud to partner with Psych Sessions. In fact, Sage has been partnering with psychology educators for a very long time, publishing STP's flagship journal, Teaching of Psychology, as well as established textbook titles in many psychology areas, including Intro Psych. And many of Sage's offerings are available on the Sage Vantage Learning Platform, which blends textbook content with multimedia activities and auto-graded assignments to drive student engagement and accountability, while giving you more time to focus on student interaction. We want to invite you to check out their Intro Psych titles by visiting collegepublishing.sagepub.com/intro psych. The Psych Sessions podcast is sponsored by STP. That is the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. That's APA Division 2. You can find them at teachpsych.org. The views or product endorsements expressed do not represent the views, support, or endorsements of STP. Psych Sessions is so grateful to have STP as a long-term supporter. Folks, Macmillan is always here to help you confront today's toughest teaching challenges, like academic dishonesty. Their recently published Educator's Guide to Academic Integrity is full of ideas for using Achieve, which is their acclaimed digital platform, to take cheating off the table. And you can get it for free at macmillanlearning.com/psych sessions. So if you're tired of students putting more work into cheating than studying, then you should definitely check it out. And don't worry, Macmillan Learning has made it easier than ever to integrate Achieve's digital content into your course. Achieve for Psychology, engaging every student, supporting every instructor, setting the new standard for teaching and learning. Again, visit macmillanlearning.com/psych sessions to receive the Educator's Guide to Academic Integrity. Hi folks, this is Garth, and I want to tell you about an intro psych book from Sumo Learning. That's SOOMO. The book is called Psychology in the Real World by author Jennifer Harper. Sumo and Harper have taken seriously the APA-IPI recommendation that scientific inquiry and research methods should be the foundation for all content areas. So they built research spotlight activities into every chapter with focus on identifying and evaluating scientific claims, which is the applied stuff that we all want our students to be able to do coming out of this course. It's got LMS integration and auto-grading and supplements like slides and test questions and notes, and it's affordable at only $50. So check it out. Go to sumolearning.com, that's SOOMO learning.com, and get a preview of psychology in the real world. Hi, folks. This is Garth, and I am so excited to be here today with Steven Fein. Steven Fein is a professor of psychology at Williams College, and that is in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Steve, welcome to Psych Sessions.
Thanks so much. It's really an honor to be here. I saw that two of your most recent podcasts are with Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson, and I'm like, why am I here? It's like, is this part of a Make-A-Wish kind of thing? Or, but I appreciate it.
I love it. Well, thank you. And you're here because we really wanted to have you on this podcast. And from what I know about you and your work, you have some, I mean, I love storytelling, Steve, and I think that you probably have some pretty cool stories based on the research that you have done. And so, first of all, for people who don't know what Williams College is or where it is, where are you in Massachusetts?
Yeah, we're in the extreme northwest corner. So it's the Berkshires, which is beautiful, right just under Vermont, and just to the east of New York State. So it's gorgeous here. It's very rural, but it's like as far away as you can be from Boston and still be in Massachusetts. So it's the other side of the state, and it's a really elite liberal arts college. Since I've been there, it's been like rated #1 in U.S. News and World Report among liberal colleges like every year, which I take full credit for, of course.
Yeah.
So I'm really blessed to have just fantastic students. I don't have to work as hard as some of my colleagues do at other schools to get them excited about learning and interested in it. So it's just a really great place to teach. And it's an undergraduate liberal arts college, so I don't have graduate students, which when I was coming out of grad school, I never envisioned myself going in this direction. We can talk about that at some point. But it's just great because they're good enough and motivated enough and disciplined enough to work with me to do really good research. And I wouldn't have come here, and I certainly wouldn't have stayed here all these years if not for that. So,
and how many years have you been there?
I've been here for about 32 years, which is a number I do not like to share.
Yeah. Really interesting. Okay. And so how big is the institution? How many students do you have?
About 2,200 students, something or like that.
That's all right. That's a really nice size. Your classrooms must be reasonable.
Yeah. My seminars, we sort of cap at like 16 or 19. Sometimes we'll have 8. And Williams has a lot of tutorials. So it's just meetings with 2 students and yourself in your office. But social psych is really, really popular here. And so I let my introductory social psych class get large because so many students want to take it. And that could be up to, 150, 180 students sometimes, which for here is huge. I know for, University of Michigan, where I went to grad school, that would be a tiny section. Right. But it feels kind of electric when the room is filled up with a lot of students.
Well, and we should tell people too that you write a social psychology textbook. So you're giving some love to Elliot Aronson, of course, who also writes a social psychology textbook. But you are in a 12th edition of your book right now. So I don't have to ask which book you use for your students. But can you just quickly tell me, how did you get into? And probably there's a story behind it, I imagine, of how.
Yeah, it's funny when I arrived at Williams. I came right out of grad school. This is the days where you didn't need a postdoc yet necessarily, and I went right from undergrad to grad school and right from grad school to here. So it's a ridiculously direct path. And when I came to Williams, I had 2 senior colleagues in social psychology. One was Al Goethals, who's and the other one was Saul Casson, and they're both great social psychologists, do great work, and are great people. And each of them had their own social psych textbook. So Casson had one with Sharon Bram, and Al Goethals had one with Joel Cooper and some other people. And that was the book I actually used as an undergrad because I get to Williams and I'm like, which senior faculty member do I piss off by not choosing their book to assign? And so I was going to just go with a neutral third party. So I actually looked at David Meyer's book because we had used that in grad school. And but I read the book that Al Goethals had co-authored and the one that Saul had co-authored, and I just fell in love with with Saul's. It just read beautifully. You talk about storytelling; it tells story. He's a great writer. And I could not use it, even though I knew by choosing him, I'm not choosing. And Al didn't care. He was a perfectly nice guy, so
Sure.
it didn't really. I got tenure eventually, despite this. But anyway, I love the book. And so Saul and I got close. We did some research together along with Al. And then he was looking for, or they were looking for someone to write like their instructor's manual and test bank and study guide. And he knew that he had a sense that I'd be good at that because, he saw me teach, he saw me write. And he felt like we were we had a consistent voice. So that's how I first joined that team, is doing the ancillaries. And then Sharon was at retirement age. And so they were looking to replace her with somebody else. And they both asked me to come on as an author as opposed to just doing the ancillaries. And it's really amazing. Like, Sharon's voice is a little bit different than Saul's and mine. But Saul and I have very similar voices, to the point where I was just doing this with the new 12th edition. My daughters were home visiting, and the book had just come out and just came out of the box. So I had them read like the introductory pages of a bunch of chapters and have them guess whether I wrote it or not. And they were not great at figuring that out. Sometimes they, oh, that's definitely you, Dad. But other times it was a hard call. So I feel like there's a real smooth consistency to us across the chapters that we take the lead on. But again, it was just the thing about our textbook that I think that I take a lot of pride in, and that I saw, when I first was just a reader of it, was great in terms of current events, lots of news and politics and sports to make it apply to things that students and people are interested in, as well as very current scholarship, and just really well written. The photographs are chosen in a really, a very careful way, that they're not just conceptually relevant, but they're aesthetically pleasing. So that's something that Saul and I both really, really value. And, we're on our 12th edition now. And at some point along the way, Hazel Marcus joined in. And so she is the person who brings in her expertise on culture, which is, she's one of the founders of that sort of area, and a giant in that. So that added a whole other element where every single chapter, because some social psych textbooks have a chapter that has culture as a feature, culture and something, maybe culture and genes or whatever. Ours has culture in every single chapter because we have Hazel Marcus. Yeah. And so we think it's relevant to every single topic there is in the field. So that's another thing about our book that we take a lot of pride in.
Let me ask you a question, because I'm quite familiar with like intro psych authors and the way that they talk about approaching their books. A lot of times they do it in partnership because do you teach intro or general psych? Okay. So it's always
the way we teach intro, sorry to interrupt, but
yeah.
We do it in a very different, unusual way. I don't know of any other school that does this. We break it up into, we have 5 instructors teaching, splitting up the course. So a neuroscientist teaches a neuroscience couple of weeks, and a cognitive psychologist teaches about cognitive and so forth. So I just teach the social part of the course.
That's interesting. That sort of layers onto kind of APA recommendations for pillars of the different areas of psychology. I don't know if you've seen these, but basically what you described was like a biological pillar, a social pillar, a social personality pillar, a cognitive pillar. Oh, I'm not going to get them all. A health pillar. Do you have a health person doing one?
We don't. We have we just recently hired a health psychologist who that's a big feature of what she talks about, but it's not specifically about she also covers other areas as well.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, as soon as you started talking about it, I thought, oh, well, that was the recommendation for choosing content for like intro psych.
Yeah. I mean, I remember, when I was in grad school at Michigan, we had, there was a great, extremely popular intro psych teacher, who the students loved. He was like a cult figure around campus.
Who was it?
Drew Weston.
Okay.
And, and he was a clinician primarily. Students would come out of that class, with a very strong passion about clinical psychology, but they'd have a much more impoverished understanding or excitement about some of the other areas.
Right.
And through no fault of Drew, it's just what he was most passionate about, and that just came through, right? And what he sort of emphasized more. And he was a great instructor. And I know of other instructors who are not as great and as talented, who, again, it's their area gets, for better or worse, the most passion, the most expertise. And students come away with, like if I had to teach the neuro section, of an intro psych class, and I do my best, I'd read up on it and I'd be okay, I think.
Yep.
But my science colleague down the hall could do a much better job of that. And similarly, I could do a much better job at social than he or she could. So that was our thinking about doing it this way. And there's some downsides to having 5 instructors rather than just one. But we really value having each area represented by someone who knows that area really, really well and is most passionate about it. So they get 5 people who all think their area is the best, So that's a great perspective, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I asked about it was exactly for what you're saying, which is we are not experts in all of these areas of psychology. Right. So intro becomes one of the very difficult courses to teach, if not maybe the most difficult course to teach, because you might be sort of expert in 1 or 2 areas, right? Is social at all like that? Because I know you said like Hazel brings this cultural component. You bring, if I'm correct, I think it's like your expertise is in stereotypes and prejudice, and I'm sure you will get into the rest of it. And then Saul, I don't know what kind of background Saul comes from, but is it like that?
In the book, you mean, or the way we teach it?
Just if I was teaching a social psych class, which I don't teach, are there things that if I'm a social psychologist that are outside of my expertise, where it's kind of harder to navigate?
I think it's an interesting question. I feel like it's an area that the different areas within social often intersect so much that if you're a reasonable scholar of the field and you do a lot of reading, you're going to be familiar with most of the areas that we want to cover. So, in a semester, you're always making choices about, I can only emphasize so much, right? And I think some instructors are hurt when they try to be extremely broad and they can't get in depth about anything because it's just they're trying to cover everything there might be. And that could be sort of like going through an art museum on a motorcycle. Oh, yeah, there's Renoir. Boom. So you want to give certain things time to breathe and to get into the depth of it. So I'm sure there might be some topics that I don't cover that someone else might, who's really, that's what their research is about. But I feel pretty comfortable covering all the areas of social psych that I think are most appropriate. And certainly by doing a textbook where, maybe the area I know the best is one particular chapter, the stereotyping and prejudice chapter, for example. But I, make it my mission to become expert at all the different, areas that I'm primarily responsible for. So I feel like I've become an even better student of the field, which then translates into better teaching because I really dive into, like, I've never done real work on like altruism, for example, in my own research, but I know that field really well, that subfield, because, I write about that and I get really excited about it. When I do, dive into the research on that and tell the stories I want to tell about them.
Anybody who's listening to you right now, who loves teaching, I've already picked it up a couple times that you really enjoy teaching. That's not always the case, right? When you're a researcher, right?
No, totally. And a lot of people. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, and I think we'll get there. I'd like to learn about where that came from and when you realize that you like teaching. But give me a moment to just ask you a couple more questions about social psych for a second. So, is your home organization or are you involved in SPSP? Is that is that the organization you call home?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes. And so I guess most social psychologists come out of grad school, and that's where they place themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what is that community like? A lot of people who listen to this podcast are probably more part of like the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. And so folks like me don't know what SPSP is like. Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, it's definitely much more focused, almost exclusively, not completely, but almost on the research side. We rarely have much discussion about teaching, formally at least. There might be a symposium at a conference about it, but it's a very small piece of. It's really all about what people are working on in terms of their research, I was actually on the executive committee of SPSP when it was first starting. And at the time, we just felt like we needed a smaller group for serious personality and social psychologists in terms of research that is less broad than like APA or, things like that, where social is just one little sliver of the whole pie. And it's good to have those conferences too, but we wanted one where we can really get into the weeds. So it's very research focused. There's a lot of networking, so there was this smaller society called Society of Experimental Social Psychologists that I belonged to, CESP. But that one, you actually had to be nominated to get in and approved, and you could only do it, I think, I can't remember how many years post PhD it is, maybe 5 years or something. So there were no grad students there, and it was very high level and exciting because they were small. You could have intimate symposia and really get to know, the giants of the field or in a small room with you, which is really cool. But it was elitist, it was exclusive. You couldn't, there weren't grad students, there weren't new assistant professors. So we wanted to have SPSB formed where we can have similar kind of smaller, intensive conference about research, but not as elitist and exclusive. So grad students could be there and you didn't have to be nominated and approved and things like that. And it just took off. I remember being trying to make decisions with the powers that be about how should we have a conference every year or every 2 years. And I was like, oh, every year is too much. We're not going to be able to field. And it was every 2 years. And by the second year, it was enormously successful. So I was totally wrong in my conservatism with that.
How has it grown? How has it grown since then? And how have they managed kind of the interest?
Yeah, I mean, the interest is there because it's the best opportunity for anybody in the field to be in the same room with the giants of the field and to get to talk to them and say, look, I've been doing this research based on your work. And so you have all these opportunities to engage in that. Plus, obviously, here everyone's cutting edge research. But it has gotten so popular that it can be overwhelming, and it definitely has lost some of that intimacy that we had early on. And sometimes some years I don't go because I'm like, it's just too much. It's too many people.
Too big, and, too much.
It's just everything is so crowded. You have to wait in line for your lunch box, your box of lunch for too long. And I don't know how to manage that. I'm no longer involved in the administration of that society. It's been years since I was.
Yeah.
But the reason people keep going is because it's just a good opportunity to see what's really current and to reunite with people you've met over the years and don't otherwise get to see.
That's helpful. And it's interesting. Would you consider yourself like mid-career, late career at this point?
I just had a birthday that makes me think late. I feel mid. I feel young.
Yeah.
But time is what it is, and I'd like to be optimistic and say mid, but I don't know.
Okay, well, and I only ask because I think that from my observations, the way that people serve over time changes, right? So,
sure.
I wonder, it sounds like you've kind of gone back to your teaching and research and writing, and right. maybe less kind of out there social, kind of building your career out there, and more I don't even know if we'd call it introvert, but kind of back to home base sort of. It seems like that's where you're
absolutely. That's definitely true. It's a good way to describe it. And it even sort of predated just age with me. It was just a little bit, it can be, one of my best friends in grad school, we would see each other at conferences after we both got our jobs at different schools. And he was so natural at being able to go up to anybody and make a conversation with them, remember them the next year. It's, oh, didn't you do this? And I would be like, I wish I had some more of that than he does. He's just so good at. And for me, it was kind of a burden to try to do all that all the time and beyond. I'd be excited about what everyone's doing, but to be able to sort of approach certain people, and it just got exhausting. And I felt like it just wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do every single year. And I'd rather just be doing my own thing, doing my writing, doing my teaching. And as you suggested, SPSP, certainly teaching is not something that's promoted or talked about very much compared to like a teaching of psychology conference. So and it's something I love so much that it just wasn't serving all of my needs as much as it might have.
Yeah. It's really it's interesting to think about as these, because some of these institutions just grow and they change over time, right? And so the players definitely change, which is a good thing. I think that one of the things you want to do is get new people plugged into these. These existing institutions. All right. So I have a final question just about your book, because I've heard, and you mentioned Dave Myers earlier, in my conversations with Dave, early on, Dave hired himself a writing coach, and he really wanted to work on voice. Now, I'm not a textbook author. I get voice, I guess, to some extent. But you mentioned voice. You mentioned that, Saul, and you have the kind of a very similar voice. When did you realize that was going to be important? And do you consciously work on it?
I don't consciously work on it, other than I do a lot of it, and I do a lot of self-editing. I do a lot of I work on I can work on a single paragraph endlessly until I feel I have it right. So in that sense, but it's not like something where I read about how to do better writing or ever taken a course in it. It's just something that always came pretty naturally to me, even starting in high school. I just loved writing. I loved English. When I got to college, I thought I'd be an English sort of literature major. So I read a lot, and I think just reading great writing is the best way to improve your own writing. And I'm a voracious reader, outside of the field. And I had, I think, several good role models when I was in school, who I think just through osmosis I absorbed some of their tendencies, but mostly I think it came through just reading great literature and books of all sorts, and then I think what makes me as successful as I can be in teaching and writing, writing a textbook, is I think, again, it comes somewhat naturally to me. It's something, but I do think about it all the time. Is I just try to take the perspective of my audience all the time. I'm what do they assume? What would they be confused by? I've and then going to conferences or seeing people come in and give talks at my school. Great researchers who sometimes start their talk on what I would say is page 12. They haven't set up the context well enough, because they're at this high level about the research, and they don't understand you got to bring people up to it. They might consciously, if you ask them, but when they actually do it, they fall right into this is my perspective, and hopefully you'll figure it out with me. So I've just I think I have a lot of empathy. And so when I'm in front of the room lecturing or in a seminar, I'm constantly looking for nonverbal cues to what are they getting? What are they confused by? And I've been doing this for over 30 years now, and I'm still very attuned to that kind of thing. I can't just think it's because it worked the last 5 years when I taught it this way, that it's going to continue. So I'm constantly reading the room. And when I'm writing, where you can't read the room, but you could project and say, what's going to work? Saying it this way, can I say it a little bit simpler? How can I inject some humor without being cutesy? That kind of thing. It's just something I think about naturally and work on in terms of writing drafts until I feel like I've got that right.
Yeah, it's so important. It's such a neat skill set for people who can understand the research and then also communicate it. I was talking to a friend in business about in psychology how we have these amazing researchers. You can go see amazing researchers and then see them give a talk, and it's not a great talk, which is nuts, right? And then you have these people who are journalists or communicators, even somebody like an Alan Alda or somebody like that, who is just very skilled at their thing, which is communication.
Right.
And then they can dabble. When you cross over, there are some researchers who can cross over, like you have done, into the communication and do it effectively. And there are some communicators who can cross over into the science and do it effectively. I just think it's a really neat space. Also a very difficult one to do well, seems to me.
Yeah. I mean, it's what drew me to social psychology in the first place was, to me, it was always about the marriage of art and science. So like I said, when I was coming out of high school, I was, all into English literature. That's what I was going to major in. And I took my first psychology classes, and Joel Cooper was the person who was teaching my first social psych class. And he's a giant in the field, one of the great founders of social psychology, and did early work on dissonance, and was very dynamic, personable teacher. But hearing the stories about these really clever experiments, which required, it was almost like creating a play,
Yeah.
You had to create a script, and you had to have direction, and you had to make it believable, have the audience suspend disbelief, but within the constraints of science. So it's got to be done in a precise way where there's not confounds and demand characteristics. The first, and I remember we had to do a little term paper on whatever we wanted, about some sub area, some research area in the field. And for whatever reason, I chose the bystander intervention research, Darley and Latané. And John Darley was down the hall. He was another professor at Princeton where I was an undergrad. And I didn't know him yet, but I think I just I must have felt like his presence somehow in the bricks and in the walls. Like Hazel Marcus has talked about how culture could sometimes be like in the brick and mortar of a building.
I like that idea.
Yeah. So, and I remember, so this is back in the day when it was before you can read journals electronically, and there's a little psychology library in the psych building. So I'd go into this little library and I'd pull out this big journal from 1968 and open it up, and the pages are all kind of grayed a little bit and they smell a little musty because it's been sitting in there for years, and read this stuff about how someone is pretending to have an epileptic seizure, and how or someone's fallen off of a ladder and screaming help, and what do the subjects do? And I just fell in love with that. Like, again, you had to create this drama, but make it believable and real, but within scientific methodology. And that combination of art and science just blew me away. Like, this is cool. And you could actually, and I remember in that first psych class, we had to design our own little experiment. And my TA for that class was Pete Ditto. He was a grad student at Princeton, and now he's a very well-known social psychologist in his own right. And we were like brainstorming about how to design some study. And I said, I had an idea, and he said, bingo. And I was like, yes. I felt so like alive that, that this grad student who seemed so old, and he was probably like, 23, thought my idea was good. And so it just went from there, and I took more and more psych classes, and I just fell in love with it. And, I grew up without any role models. I was a first generation college student. I didn't know anybody in my family whose career was something they did because they enjoyed it. It's just, this is what they can get paid for.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in a place called Bayonne, New Jersey. So it's right near New York City. It's pretty lower working class. And that's how, that's what I grew up in. And my father worked in the postal service, and, was fairly miserable, but, at the job, but it was secure, and, it brought home enough to, for us to live on. So I just expected at some point I'll find a job like that will just, be what I have to do.
Nobody was going to college around to.
Nobody was going to college. And then I stumbled into this, and shockingly, I've been doing it ever since. And I've like every day I think about it, it's like I'm so lucky to be doing something I absolutely love.
So from when you were a kid, is there any kind of foreshadowing of kind of the arts in what you said you like to read and write? So that was probably something.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there was, and I'm not thinking of, but what really clicked for me was just some good teachers. It's as simple as that. I had like an English teacher in like 7th and 8th grade who was like one of the meanest women you'll ever. She was like a caricature. You watch these old movies and like they're gonna beat you with the ruler. They didn't do that, but it was that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But she just instilled like, a sense of how to write properly. She would make us diagram sentences so we'd have all the grammar right. And I still remember those lessons all these years later. I hated her, but I have enormous respect for how effective she was as a teacher. And then in high school, I just had a few teachers who were really inspiring. And in particular, my an honors English class teacher that I had for like 2 or 3 years. And he stood out in the school. He was weird. He was a nonconformist in a school that was a lot of conformity. I'm sure he didn't get along with any of the other teachers in administration because he was, I think he lived in New York City and commuted in and would go to plays and encourage us to do this stuff. And I just fell in love with what he was dishing out. And I would occasionally go to plays with small groups in the city, and it just created this love of writing and literature and drama that stayed with me.
It's interesting to hear you, first of all, talk about theaters because I wonder if that's some of the overlap, right? But when I talked to Elliot Aronson recently, and he discussed, just like you did, kind of designing the script and right. Making sure it works and it's believable. It is like going to the theater or something like that, where you need to make sure that it is authentic. Right. And so, so if I had to do it all over again, there's a couple of careers that, and kind of, if I could do it all over again, probably social psychology would be in there for me. My background is counseling psych, but, or marketing, strangely. I really like that world, but I think that, there are so many, and I was actually talking to Wood, good friend, about this, that there are so many people, there are so many teachers that I have met who have some sort of background in the arts, which is interesting to me.
Yeah.
And I wonder, what that is about kind of our love for theatrics, for being able to communicate something in a way that is memorable. Yeah. And
I think it's certainly, go ahead. It has to make for better teaching, that kind of love and exposure. To just, again, make your students excited about what you're teaching them and because there is a performance element to it, and not everyone cares about that or is particularly good at it, but and it's not fake, it's real, but you still need to be performing it in a way that keeps everyone excited and engaged on a cold February morning, and it's so, like, I've the last year I've been teaching a psych stats class. And so this is a required course for the major. The large majority of students do not want to be taking this course if they could get away with not doing it, because that's not what they signed up for psychology for, right? And I make I love the challenge of teaching it for that reason. And the very first thing I tell my students is my goal for this course is at the end of the semester, you're going to say, that didn't suck. Yeah. And then, in the end, they're like, yeah, you're right. And actually, I kind of enjoy coming to class. And the only way to do that is by bringing your own passion and making it clear why this is relevant. First of all, teaching in a clear way and all that. But so that's obviously important and necessary. But you need to do more than that. And you need to bring your own enthusiasm and energy to it. And then it's contagious. And then they see, oh, this could be fun and interesting. And they could see why it's relevant to all kinds of things other than just how do I do this analysis. So
do you lean on your social psychology research and expertise for teaching that stats class? Is that what you pull from? Yeah, of
I
course,
definitely do.
because it's
Yeah.
inherently interesting, right?
Yeah. And, a lot of social psychology today is not that interesting. I mean, it's interesting in what the points, the theoretical points that are being made, but the research itself can be pretty dry. Stats, the complexity of stats today has just gone up. It's been a revolution in this, which is important. And there's a lot of good to that. But the old studies of creating a drama and even how live subjects is now a lot of it's done online and you never see the person and they're not in the same room with you. And we need that for sample size and statistical power and things like that. But you lose a little bit of that excitement that some of the classics, would give. And I feel like I'm very old school. I still do that. I do a lot of research online because I have to. But my favorite studies I've been involved, and I try to bring some of that even in the online world.
Sure.
Making for a compelling story or whatever, but it's not the same. Like the first studies I really felt I took ownership over in grad school. I was basically like a film director. I had a script, I had Confederates, I had to rehearse them. This one study where we had this woman being interviewed for a job and I had to make her good enough, but not too good, so that there was room for participants to like her or not. So there's, based on the stereotypes that we played with. And it just I was having the best time just being like a director of this little movie we were creating.
Are the questions different now for social psychologists? Or maybe a different way to say that is, can we study the same questions with the new world, with the new technology, with the new way that things are being done, with the new statistics or whatever?
Right. I think they can be. I think a lot of them are. I think there's certainly, there's always new things to that become more in vogue or not. But I it's just a different approach. And you can't necessarily answer the same questions at a more micro level. But in terms of general theoretical conceptual issues that we're trying to tackle, whether it's prejudice or whether it's altruism or whether it's aggression or group dynamics, we're still looking at those kind of things. Certainly.
Yeah. Okay. So at what point do you decide to go to college when you were in high school? And how did that happen? Yeah.
Right. I just, I was on like an honors track in high school. I was just academically very successful. That seemed like, well, then that's what you do when you're getting good grades. Because our high school was very like, there's like a tech program. There was like a business program and there was like a honors program. And it's based on, how you did your first years, you sort of get tracked into those. So my high school was very split in terms of that. And most of the students did the sort of tech or business. And then there were some that went to the sort of honors where the expectation was, and you go to college with this, right? So it just seemed like, okay, that's what you have to do. I knew nothing about the different schools out there. I didn't know anybody. I mean, some of the students who graduated right before me went to some different colleges, so I knew a little bit through them. But I was pretty clueless about it. But again, I had this honors English teacher who just took me under his wing. And it's like, awesome. No, you got to go to one of these kind of schools. So you have the potential. And I was like, okay, I'll apply. And it just sort of, just kind of worked out.
How many schools did you apply to? You remember?
I think something like 8 or 9.
Okay.
It's a really funny story actually about how I wound up in Princeton. So, I got into some great schools, including Princeton and Yale. I remember I was choosing, I really liked both of them when I visited, but the financial aid package they were both offering was just not good enough for what my family felt they could afford. It would just be too much of a sacrifice. So most of the students who went to college from my high school went to the State University of New Jersey, which is Rutgers. So I was like, okay, I'll just go there and it'd be basically free. I got a scholarship, so it'll be free. So that's an easy decision. But in my senior year, my guidance counselor gave me a bunch of, as they did everybody, a bunch of like forms to fill out for potential fellowships or scholarships rather. And one of them, which I didn't pay any attention to when I filled it out, was the Golden Nugget Scholarship. Golden Nugget was a casino in Las Vegas and New Jersey. I figured, okay, maybe they have like $100 gift for people in those states. So I get this call that I've reached the finalist round, and I have to write this essay to be evaluated. And this is like late in my senior year. I was like, I don't want to do this. What the golden nugget? What the hell is this? I'm going to be going to Rutgers. I don't need this. And it's the only time in my life where my father pushed me academically. Like, no, you got to do this. Never did that before, but somehow he's like, no, you got to at least give this a shot. So I almost passively aggressively wrote a really weird, I thought, stream of consciousness essay. And then, I don't know, a couple weeks later, I get a call that I've won a scholarship, and I have to go to Atlantic City to meet this guy named Steve Fein, who I'd never heard of. And I couldn't Google his name yet. That didn't exist. So my father and I drive down to Atlantic City. I go to the front desk, and I said, I'm supposed to meet someone named Steve Fein. And like, oh, you're going to go to the penthouse. So turns out, it seems like your face, you recognize the name. He was the owner of the Golden Nugget and was one of the richest men in the world. And it's become a huge mogul since then. And, anyway, so we go to his office, and he says how my essay just spoke to him. It reminded him of himself when he was, high school kid. And he gave me like this enormous scholarship, thousands and thousands of dollars, to go to any school in New Jersey. Or Nevada. So I was like, I guess I could go to Princeton. And then he changed it like, an hour later. I actually can go to any school you want. I don't care. But by then I was like, all right, I decided on Princeton. So that's how I wound up there as opposed to anywhere else.
And he personally.
So basically the mafia, I think, helped fund my,
but he personally read your essay. He personally read those essays.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. You remember what it was about? You remember what you talked about?
I remember the title was A Multiple Singularity. It was just about how you have multiple selves. I was an early psychology kind of thing, I guess.
Yeah.
Beyond that, I couldn't tell you. It was just something about like, I have this part of me, I have this part, and he just liked it for whatever reason.
And was that the end of your communication with him? No,
every year while I was in college, he'd have a dinner that he invited me and some of the other scholarship winners over the years. And there are people like Kenny Rogers or the governor of New Jersey would be there and, shake our hands. And then, we kept a little bit of a correspondence over the years. And when I was at a conference, actually SPSB in Las Vegas, a number of years later, and I stayed at the Mirage, which was one of his hotels at the time. So I got to say a quick hello and thank him for him starting me off on, what turned into my career. I gave him a copy of my textbook, actually.
That's wild.
But then we lost touch after that. Yeah. He's become a controversial figure.
Yeah.
This is well that I'm not hanging out with Steve.
Okay, so undergraduate experience at Princeton. How was that?
I loved it academically. It was a great psychology program. I got involved in a lot of research. Every student has to do a senior thesis and a junior basically thesis. My main advisor was someone named Charlie Lord, sweet guy. He did some really interesting research so we designed this project on, attitudes about capital punishment. And we wanted to see if people who were very pro death penalty, even promoting mandatory sentences for certain kind of crimes. Like if you commit mass murder and you're found guilty, you're put to death. No, there's no judge discretion or jury discretion. That's a sentence. If you gave them information about the person, the defendant, that humanized them, didn't make them likable, but just made them they have a dog named Boomer, and some other little facts that could be true of anybody, that people were willing to say, nah, they shouldn't be put to death, So if they fit basically their prototype for what a mass murder probably is like, yes, they should be convicted. They should be sentenced to death. But if they were surprisingly different from what each participant expected of a mass murder, what their personality would be like, then they wouldn't. So I had to create this sort of creativity where for each subject we had asked them a bunch of questions about what do you think a mass murderer is like in these different ways, these different traits and relationships and stuff. And I had to craft a story about a defendant that either did or didn't fit that prototype. For each person, it's a little bit different. And so that's what we did for my senior thesis. And Ned Jones, who is one of my heroes, he's one of the fathers of attribution theory, was sort of a secondary advisor for me. So I wound up just hanging out in the psych department all the time. They even gave me an office there, which was kind of crazy. And I just absorbed it. I loved it. So I loved it academically. I didn't love my social life there at Princeton. I didn't feel like I fit in, which is probably my own fault than anybody else's. But
what was it like? Because I think probably there are a lot of students who felt that way or feel.
Yeah, I'm sure it was one of those things where you think you're the only one who's like an imposter here. Plenty of others, right? We know that. But it just seemed to me like everyone else knew the drill, and I kind of didn't. And I remember one of my roommates, his father took us out to dinner, and I remember we're driving, and he said, "So where did you prepare?" And I had no idea what that meant. It's like, for dinner, I just put on a fresh shirt, right? And he meant like, what prep school did I go to? And I didn't know about prep schools. So it's that kind of thing. And certainly the majority of students probably weren't like that, but enough were. And I just didn't feel, comfortable immediately. I probably just became a self-fulfilling prophecy after a little while, where I was a little distant from maybe the mainstream there. I had groups of friends and had some fun and stuff, but I just didn't love the culture so much, socially, but I loved the academics, and not just in psychology, English, philosophy, astronomy, even just there was great teaching there, which I loved.
Yeah. It reminds me of in fact, I think an early episode. One of the only times I ever interviewed a non-psychologist for this podcast was I interviewed my friend. His name is Mohammed Hamoudi, and he's a lawyer, and he was a public defender in Seattle. And his job was to take these people who have done horrendous things and to go in front of the judge and basically to humanize them. In front of, a lot of context. But I mean, what your research, what you were describing just then was exactly, I feel like, what he's doing in a real life situation.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And, and it works to some extent, right? I mean, it, you've studied it, you've seen the results, right? Your work is, I think, just the work of social psychologists, but your work in particular, human beings can relate to it, right? We see it. Yeah. Can you just talk a little bit about maybe some of the work? Because after this, you go to Michigan State, right? Or to Michigan.
University. Michigan, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I just offended like a lot of people out there.
Yeah, you did. Right.
We'll edit that out. Just kidding. Okay. So University of Michigan, and by the way, where was Mikichi retired already by the time you went to the University of Michigan?
No, he was still around.
Was he?
I didn't know him, but I knew of him.
Yeah. Interesting. Just like a giant in teaching, right?
Yes,
in teaching psychology. Okay, so how did you make the decision to go to the University of Michigan?
All right. Mostly, I had great social psychologists at Princeton in my department who I got to know. So people like Ned Jones and Joel Cooper, eventually John Darley, my advisor, Charlie Lord. And they were all telling me, okay, these are the best schools right now in social psych. So University of Michigan was considered, for what I was interested in, it's like, that's the place you should go. So I was choosing between, at the end, it came down to Michigan, and I got into Harvard, and Ned Jones, I remember saying, well, Harvard is a name, so you might want to consider it. It's not that great right now. It's, at the time, it was in a low point. Became, what it would be again, but time, it was not maybe the ideal place. But you should, University of Michigan's where a lot of the action is right now, and NYU is the other school. So I was choosing between young John Barge, whose research was like a perfect fit for what I was interested in. I was really motivated social cognition. That's what excited me. And then at Michigan, it was more like how many great people there were, and all my advisors were telling me what a great program it was. So, and I'd grown up right outside New York City. I went to school in New Jersey, for undergrad. And I just thought it'd be good for me to go somewhere else and not be back in, although living in Greenwich Village was always my dream, because I love that. It's my favorite area of the city. But I feel like I should, venture a little away. So that was the sort of deciding factor, and I went to Michigan. But again, why Michigan as opposed to other schools? It was just because that's what my advisors were all saying is the best place for what I was interested in.
All right. And I
worked with a very young,
yeah,
a guy who was at Princeton. He just recently got his PhD at Princeton. So we actually even overlapped, I think, by a year when he was a grad student. I was an undergrad. So he was very young, assistant professor at Michigan, and very hungry, trying to get tenure and stuff. And we just really worked well together initially. And he was he's a very good teacher.
And I think I talked over you. Who was that?
James Hilton is his name.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And he was, he was someone who I think was much more passionate about his teaching than his research. And he was a great teacher. And again, I just absorbed some of his lessons and how do you teach a social psych class. And that was really, I think, influential for me.
Yeah. So is that where you taught your first classes?
Well, the TAs would lead a discussion section.
Yeah.
So I got a lot of practice with that. I did it every semester. And I did actually get to co-teach an entire course, which is very unusual at the time for an undergrad. I co-taught it with Dick Nisbet, who's a really big deal in the field, and he was teaching our research method class. And Nisbet, as he is a superstar in the field, but he was very nervous about his teaching. He didn't feel like he did it well. I don't know if that changed over the years, but at the time he was like, and he just wanted somebody else who had a good reputation as a teacher for a grad student. And I guess he heard I was, so he invited me to co-teach the course. So I actually gave half the lecture in this class, which is a great experience. So that was my first time I was like half responsible for a whole course.
Yeah, and you were doing research at the same time.
Yeah,
right,
all the time. Yeah,
yeah, but you came out of that experience with a PhD, and at that point you were applying what? Did you think you're going to primarily do research, or were you hoping to teach, or how did that work its way out?
I mean, I want to do both. I wouldn't happily accept an offer where I couldn't do both. And both would be valued. Now, if no offers were out there, then I take what I had to. But I was really hoping that would work out. And I expected to be at a place like the University of Michigan, an R1 university, but where, like my advisor, you could still teach so I was actually in the end choosing between two schools that could not be more different on almost every dimension. It was UCLA or Williams College. Wow. And the only reason I even knew about Williams College and applied was because I met Al Goethals. He'd come to Michigan for a talk, and he was a senior social psych person here at Williams. And I loved him. He talked up Williams and where you can really, we're both around valued and expected research and teaching. He said, you really should just apply and check it out, come visit. And I did. And and that's where I met Saul Casson, and I just fell in love with the people. And shocked myself by choosing Williams. I never lived somewhere so rural. But I just absolutely love the students and love my colleagues. And here I am all these years later.
32 years later. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So you've done some pretty interesting research. Thanks. Can you talk about what is the research that you're asked to talk about most? That's what I want to share with our audience here.
Okay.
I've read a little bit about it, so maybe you could just share a couple of them.
Yeah, there's two, I guess, that come up the most. One is just in my mind because every 4 years I get all of a sudden journalists and stuff start contacting me when the presidential debates are about to happen.
Yes.
So I just have gotten a slew of these, which is kind of fun. I haven't done the research in a long time, but so I often forget, oh yeah, I used to do this. But I still keeping on top of the research that other people do on it. But about presidential debates, and a lot of my research, I have two basic primary strands of research. One is on sort of called motivated social cognition, and how, for example, the way we express stereotyping or prejudice is often influenced without our knowledge by how we want to see the world. So motivation. So that's one line I've done a lot of work on. The other one is about social norms, how our perceptions of how other people like us, what they think influences us. So the debate stuff came from that second category about social norms. I remember watching presidential debates and hearing the audience reaction. And so if people are really applauding or one candidate more than the other, could that be influencing people at home who, ultimate voters? And from what we know about social psych, it certainly might, right? So we wanted to put that to the test. So I did it in a few different ways. During a debate, during a presidential debate, I had people watch in one of 3 different rooms in groups of like 20, 25. And we sprinkled in a handful of Confederates to really make a lot of noise for promoting one candidate over the other during the debate, like really like applauding what this one candidate would say a lot more and kind of snicker at the other candidate. And it just, we obviously randomly assigned people to one condition. They promoted one person, another one was the other one. And a third condition, there were no Confederates that vocalized at all. And we got enormous differences. I've never seen such huge differences in perceptions of all the other, the naive participants in terms of who they thought won the debate and who they would probably vote for. And then we did a study in the same line where instead we took an old debate. We took the sort of famous debate between Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale. This is the second of the debates. The first debate, Reagan had done terribly. He was a wildly popular incumbent president at this point. He was going to wipe the floor up with Mondale, but in his first debate, he was already at the time, it's kind of interesting how it's come back into the current discussion. He was already the oldest president ever, and there was worries about his age and whether he was actually starting to lose it cognitively, right? And he seemed like he'd lost his train of thought multiple times during the first debate. People were like, really? Oh, he might lose. So all of a sudden the poll started closing and Mondale had a chance. In the second debate, Reagan was ready in his team for a question about his age. And I think it was the very first or maybe second question in the debate. The moderator asked him about, well, are you maybe too old for this? I remember when President Kennedy had to stay up all night during the Cuban Missile Crisis, blah, blah, blah. And Reagan said, no, I don't think age should be an issue in the campaign. And also, I'm not going to exploit, I can't remember the exact word. I'm not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience. So he took the question and flipped it. And the audience laughed and the moderator laughed, Mondale laughed. And then he milked it. He took some water while they're all laughing to milk it longer because he's an actor. Yeah. He says, I don't know if it was Seneca or Cicero who said something like, if not for the elders of the society, there would be no civilization. So hilarious little joke on age, and then this brilliant little pithy. Now, of course, it was all pre-rehearsed. Of course. And his team knew whether it was Seneca or Cicero, but he acted as if he's going back to his college days to remember this line, to show how his memory was intact. So anyway, and Mondale himself said later, I knew the election was over at that moment because he hit it out of and even the moderator said, you hit that one out of the park. I remember thinking, how much did that moment matter in the debate? So it was a 90-minute long debate. And how much did the reaction of everyone matter in and above the content of what was said? So we had participants, Williams students, years after this, watch the debate, 90 minutes debate, and we either left it in intact or we took out that whole question and answer. So 87 minutes were the same, but not those 3. Or we left it in, but we took out all the reaction. There was no laughter, no applause. It just went to the next question. And we found in the control condition where we didn't edit anything, everyone thought Reagan easily won the debate, right? If we took out the whole exchange, it became more like 50-50. And it was a huge victory for Reagan or basically a toss-up. But, excuse me, in the condition where they left it in, we left it in, but took out the reaction. A huge win for Mondale. So more than what Reagan said, it was how it was validated by the audience. So if there was no reaction, people could say, he didn't answer the question, right? He skirted it. That's not right. So it's about the social validation, not about what he actually said. that actually made a real big difference.
I have an observation and a question. For my observation is it reminds me of a comic who's bombing, who puts something out there and then it's not received. It gets very awkward very quickly. I wonder what's going on there.
Right.
My question was, did the experimental condition, which of the experimental conditions occurred to you first, and did you add one afterwards, or did you always know it was going to be 3, or is that too far back for you to go?
Well, it's probably too far back for me to be 100% accurate in what I'm about to say.
Yeah.
It's possible I'm not remembering this correctly, but I felt like I think it was both, all 3 all the time, because I wanted to know the answer to both questions. How much did this soundbite matter?
Yeah.
And so take it out or leave it in was clearly that had to be 2 conditions.
Yep.
And then how much did the reaction matter? And then so therefore there had to be that 3rd condition. So that was always part of what I wanted both of those questions answered. Nick, I would have been happy if it was just, one or the other. But the fact that both of them worked in different, to different degrees was really kind of fascinating.
I do kind of think about the classic like social psychology studies, or not even the classic ones, the really interesting ones like what you've done, and wonder like what would have happened if they would have just gone a little further to test some other condition that they didn't. Would we have found out something really interesting? Yeah, and that's kind of the fun of it.
Right.
To think back. It's also what drives the research forward. So that was the big one, or that was one of them. Can you tell us about the other one as well?
Yeah, the other one, which is certainly more, I think, important in the field. It's the thing I get cited for the most and stuff. The presidential debate one just is fun because every 4 years it becomes interesting again to people. This is work I started in grad school with another grad student, actually, Steve Spencer. He was a year or 2 behind me in grad school, and he was a student of Claude Steele, and who's one of my giant heroes. I love him. But the 2 of us, I remember when I first heard Claude Steele give what turned out to be his job talk in Michigan. He was at University of Washington at the time, came to Michigan, gave a talk, and it's the first time I heard about self-affirmation theory. And I remember thinking, so the way self-affirmation is basically when you make people think about values and aspects of themselves that they feel really good about and feel safe when they think about it. And it affirms their sense of self. And it's sort of what Claude was doing with it initially was as an alternative to cognitive dissonance. Like if you, in a situation where we normally experience cognitive dissonance and then change your attitudes to be consistent with your behavior, if you actually make people feel good about themselves on something completely unrelated, that little threat from dissonance doesn't matter so much to you anymore because you're a good person. So if you did this and this thing, so what? And you don't change your attitude. And I thought that was, that was pretty interesting. But so the way they did affirmation is I basically handed people like a values checklist and got them to think about something that's really important to them. I'm like, well, how do people affirm in the wild, like naturally, or do they? And I was thinking, because I was really interested in stereotyping and prejudice, that sometimes people might use negative stereotypes and prejudice to make someone else seem worse than yourself. And that makes you feel better in comparison, right? Downward social comparison. And I wonder if that was kind of affirming, a kind of a self-affirmation. So I talked about this with my friend, who was a Claude student. Well, do you think this might work? So we decided to investigate this in a few different ways. And so I wanted to look at a group that there was a strong negative stereotype about, but that people don't feel so bad about using. It wasn't as politically incorrect to use it. So this is, again, where the sort of art of it is, like, what's the right way to execute this idea that basically if you make people feel better or worse about themselves, will that affect how likely they are to engage in prejudice towards someone based on their group membership? So what group? And at the time, this was at University of Michigan, there was a pretty strong negative stereotype about Jewish American princesses, they called them. So Jewish women who came often from New York, like Long Island in particular, who were seen as entitled and spoiled and privileged. And there'd be all these Jap jokes, Jewish American princess jokes at the time. There's even a TV show about, like, The Nanny was about, like, this Jewish American princess. So people didn't feel so bad about telling Jap jokes because they were seen as a privileged group. They could take it and deserve it. So anyway, I thought that would be an interesting group to utilize. So we had It's also a group where you can have someone seem to be a member of that group or not. So we found a woman, an undergrad, who looked like she could be Jewish or maybe not, depending on how we made her up and stuff and what she was wearing. And I asked the undergrads what a Jewish American princess looked like and what they wore, and they had very specific things, like a certain kind of hair clip, for example, and a certain color sweatshirt. So we got all that information, and we had I had this woman. We took a picture of her with the hair clip or not, with a Star of David or a cross. So the same woman looking either like she's probably Jewish or she probably isn't. And we created a fake resume about her that was identical for all the relevant stuff except her name was either Julie Goldberg or something else. Her sorority, all the sororities in Michigan at the time were incredibly segregated. You had some sororities that, one or two that were almost all Jewish women, and others that had no Jewish women in them. So she was a member of one of the other sorority, and I think there was one other little feature. Oh, she was wearing the cross or the Star of David. But all the details were the same. And then we had them watch a video of her being interviewed. That's where I was talking about my directing debut was having. So we wanted to have her be pretty good, but not great. So we had participants read the resume, watch her job interview, and they rate her on how good they think she'd be for the job, how intelligent, how likable, et cetera. Before that, they were in what was ostensibly an unrelated study where they took an intelligence test that we just created. And we gave them fake feedback to make them either feel really good or really bad. They were in the 98th percentile or the 47th percentile. And of course, at the end of the study, we showed them it was all random and all that. So when they were feeling good about themselves, there was the subjects who thought they were evaluating a Jewish woman rated her just as well as the subjects who thought she wasn't Jewish. No bias at all. But if they were feeling bad about themselves, they derogated the hell out of her if they thought she was Jewish. And most interesting, the more they did that, the more they derogated her when she was Jewish, the better they felt about themselves after the study. After that evaluation. So by derogating her, they sort of felt, superior to her. Now, I'm sure for 90% of the subjects, it was completely unconscious. If they knew they did that, they'd feel bad. They wouldn't feel better about themselves. They feel worse if they were unfair and biased. But they had no idea. And what the stereotype allowed them to do is to basically create a lens through which they could see her negatively. Like they could say, oh yeah, she seemed whiny. She seemed stuck up, but it wasn't in the video or the resume. It's just they had, oh, she's Jewish and from this group and the sorority, she must be. So it justified, whereas they didn't do that for the other woman. Like they could have, they were feeling bad about themselves. They evaluated just a woman from a neutral group. They could have derogated her too and felt superior, but they didn't have an excuse for it. They didn't have an easy tool to justify their derogation of her. The Jewish woman part of it gave them that. And that's why they derogated her so much and felt better to the extent that they did that.
So you observed this difference, and it's pretty self-evident what the difference was. Mm-hmm. Did you theorize what mechanisms are going on that cause somebody to do this?
Yeah, I think partly it's a downward social. The stereotype allowed for an easy opportunity to engage in downward social comparison. It gave them an opportunity to make her seem worse than she was. And therefore, in comparison, I messed up in this test, but I'm not this terrible person, and it affirmed them. It's like, oh yeah, I'm not like that. I actually am a good person. I'm not whiny. I'm not materialistic. I'm not, et cetera, et cetera. So I screwed up on this test, but so what? It's just a temporary thing. So I think that it gave them like a filter that would justify their downward social comparison against this other person.
Where do you see your research kind of in our world today? I know it's a long time ago, and so you've probably moved on in the things that you're thinking about, or when you're cited, what are people studying when they're...
Yeah, I mean, there's still people doing that kind of work, and I'm doing it to some extent. I think the more general picture is that how, again, our motivation, in this case, we're motivated to see ourselves as better than other people or some other person because we're feeling this threat about ourselves. And, there are other ways of dealing with that threat. that could be good or bad. But this idea that you have this motive to fix your threatened self-image, and you're looking for the easiest path to do that. And that manifests itself in all kinds of interesting ways. So people are doing that kind of thing, and I'm doing that kind of thing. Like politically, if you're like really motivated to see your side as the right one, how you'll take information and completely distort it, so that, see, I was right and you were wrong. And you get this political polarization because you get more and more fuel for why I'm even more right and you're even more wrong. And it satisfies when you're feeling insecure, when you're feeling threatened, which we all are these days often. And the social media and the media just, will fuel all that the way it's curated. Constant feeling of existential threat. So how do you deal with that? So you find scapegoats to sort of put it all on, whether it's the migrants or whether it's the MAGA, whatever it is. So I think that's really relevant, today, if not more than ever, perhaps.
Yeah, really. I just, whenever I talk to you social psychologists, I always think about, okay, what am I participating in right now that I am totally, that I'm unconscious of? And I think we all need to ask ourselves that question because it's kind of out of control, right? The masses are not thinking about it. They're not aware of it, and it's got really, really bad outcomes associated with it. It's kind of troubling to see. It must be interesting for you to kind of know some of what's going on in those situations. Yeah.
It's interesting, but it's also terrifying because you know that it's going to happen, and there's nothing people are going to do about it. Hopefully with better education, you can sort of be aware of it. And but it's in all, you see it manifested in some, like I just did this series of studies this past year as part of my stats class, where we were looking at attitudes about Taylor Swift in the NFL. So we did one experiment where we had people, and this is done online with, hundreds of people from around the country, where we had them, we showed them images from different sports, and asked them, is this from the NFL or not? So everyone who agreed to be in the study had to have some familiarity with football, and interest in it. So we showed them pictures from basketball or from college or from the NFL, and asked them, so is this from the NFL or not? Or are these pictures from that? And after a little while, in one condition, in the midst of several NFL action photos, there were some of Taylor Swift at Chiefs games, like celebrating, right? Or not, with other fans celebrating, but not Taylor Swift. And then after they went through this exercise, we asked them to rate how much do you like the NFL? And we found that conservatives, if they were exposed to just 3 images of Taylor Swift at games compared to like 15 other NFL things, rated the NFL significantly less positively if they saw those Taylor Swift images than they didn't. Now they had no idea they were doing this, but it just was another example. Like, she threatens certain people in her presence, this woman, liberal woman, invading my space of the NFL, which is our territory, and it sort of created this sort of negative feeling about the entire league that they love, and again, it's all part of the same, I think, psychology about, like, she creates this sort of little bit of a threat, annoyance, like she doesn't belong within this group, and it just pisses me off, and that it sort of leaks over into the whole NFL isn't what it used to be.
Oh, wow. Well, that is some real world research. I love that.
The whole reason I did it was because I wanted my students to learn how to do the analyses necessary for the stats, but do it on something fun and that they'd be really meaningful to them. So
it got so much coverage, but why not, as a psychologist, ask a scientific question about it and show students how to think through it? I love it. Steve, I have taken a bunch of your time, but before we go, is there anything else? I always want to give people a chance to promote or to just like tell our audience anything that you're working on or else that you're writing about or whatever. Is there anything else that you want to share with folks?
Well, great. Thanks. I guess, again, we didn't talk as much as maybe I might have about the textbook because it's something I have just great pride in. I just want people to just look at it and read. Like, if you read just the intro, like 2 pages per chapter, and you'll get a sense of how it's written. And I just would hope that people who otherwise haven't checked it out, if they teach social psych class, just to check it out. It's the authors are Cass and Fein and Marcus. In terms of research that I'm doing right now, one of the lines of research I'm excited about is looking at, again, this brings up norms and prejudice together. I've been looking at attitudes about things like American conservatives' attitudes about like same-sex marriage and gay couples adopting, and how they're very, overall very negative toward those, to gay rights compared to liberals. So what I wanted to do was to see if, again, norms might actually change some of those otherwise intractable attitudes, because you could reconstrue what a classic conservative attitude might be about something like same-sex marriage, like saying conservatives don't think the government should be involved in our everyday lives. What happens behind closed doors, government should keep out. So who cares who's, as long as I don't want to see it necessarily because I don't like that. But if they're behind closed doors married, I don't care. Conservatives shouldn't care about that. The government shouldn't get involved. That's obviously not the attitude most conservatives have, but it could be in a counterfactual world. So did a study or series of studies and we're still ongoing, where we had liberals and conservatives. We asked them their attitudes about stuff like that. But we had, before they expressed their attitudes, we had them see other alleged subjects' answers to the questions about this. And they were either, a mixed group of liberals and conservatives, or it was only fellow conservatives who said very standard conservative things about other things, like, they're very pro-gun, anti-regulation of guns. But in terms of something like same-sex marriage, I said this stuff I was just talking about, how, 10 years ago, I would have been totally opposed to this, but I realize now the government should keep out of it. So as long as I don't have to see it, as long as I don't have to see it on my TV commercials and stuff. So again, it's clear they don't like, gay stuff. But I don't care. Government, we should keep out of it. They want to get married, they want to adopt, that's up to them. To see if that would actually change conservatives' attitudes. And it did. It had a significant effect. And we're also I had a senior thesis student this past year where we're doing similar things with gun control kind of issues and getting some movement on that based on those kind of things.
Interesting.
So that's the most recent work I'm doing at the moment.
Yeah, I always feel like politicians should be reaching out to psychologists to ask them how to proceed with kind of moving the needle on some of these issues.
I remember. Sorry to take up more time, but I remember at the height of the pandemic when the director of National Institute of Health, I think it was sort of bemoaning that they wished that they had given more funding to social psych research to better address why there's so much resistance to the education they were trying to give about the pandemic and about vaccines and stuff. And all of the work was going to the science about how to get the best vaccines and stuff, and how to get treatments, which of course has to be done. But there should have been also more attention. If we knew the social psychology better of how do you get people to understand and be receptive to these messages, and he had kind of wished that there had been more of that. So I do think there's a lot potential contribution to be made with listening to social science research more than they do, not just social psych, but all social science work, I'd say.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that they do listen a little bit. Hey, Steve, it was really nice to meet you. Folks, the book is Social Psychology, 12th edition. Steve's still doing some research. You can find his articles wherever great articles are sold. If you want to go to check out Steve's book on Sage Publishing's website, you can do it at collegepublishing.sagepub.com and learn more there. Steve, thanks for taking the time today. I want to wish you all the best, and maybe I'll see you at a teaching conference someday.
That'd be great. Thanks so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Hey folks, if you want to check out Steve's social psychology textbook, the 12th edition, just visit collegepublishing.sagepub.com and you can search for the book there. Thanks.